The wind screamed across the Afghan ridgeline like a living thing, clawing at the rocks and dragging sheets of snow across the mountain. Visibility was almost nothing, just a blinding swirl of white and shadow. Then the first rifle shot cracked through the storm. Not ours. I was already lying prone behind a frozen rock shelf when the round slammed into the sandbags beside my head. The impact exploded into a burst of ice and dirt that stung my face through the scarf wrapped around it. "Contact South Ridge," someone shouted over the radio. But I didn't answer. I was already looking through my scope, steady and still, watching the valley below. Shapes moved through the storm. 3 figures, then 5, then more silhouettes appearing out of the snow like ghosts climbing out of the earth. Too many. Behind me, Echo Recon's outpost was just beginning to wake up, boots pounding across metal floors, radios crackling, soldiers scrambling to defensive positions. But the moment I saw the direction those fighters were moving, a cold realization settled deeper than the mountain wind. They weren't attacking the base. They were climbing toward the pass. That narrow strip of rock was the only road our convoy could use at sunrise. Every supply truck, every medic vehicle, every soldier traveling to the valley would pass directly beneath this ridge. If the enemy reached it first, the convoy wouldn't stand a chance. It would be a slaughter. And I was the only sniper close enough to stop it, which made the memory from earlier that night almost laughable. Less than an hour before, Major Carter Hayes had looked me over in the command tent, eyes full of doubt, and said the words I can still hear like they were shouted yesterday. "Send the kid home." But the storm had closed the mountain roads. The helicopter couldn't fly, and now the kid he wanted gone was the only thing standing between 30 enemy fighters and an entire column of American soldiers. The truth was simple. No backup, no second sniper, no retreat. Just me, a rifle, and a frozen mountain full of enemies climbing toward the ridge. And I was already pulling the trigger. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Lady Veteran Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Specialist Avery Cole, United States Army Reconnaissance Sniper. At least that's what the paperwork said. But when I walked into Echo Recon's command post that night, nobody inside that room saw a sniper. They saw a mistake. The command post was a cramped plywood building reinforced with sandbags and dim red lights. Radios crackled constantly. A tactical map of the valley covered the center table, its surface crowded with greased pencil markings and movement reports. Every soldier in that room looked hardened by the mountains. Thick winter gear, long deployments, faces worn by cold exhaustion and too many nights without sleep. Then I stepped through the door. 5'6", barely 120 pounds. Snow still dusting my shoulders from the storm outside. And suddenly the entire room went quiet. Major Carter Hayes, Echo Recon's commanding officer, looked up from the map. His eyes landed on me. Then he slowly looked down at the personnel file in his hand, then back at me again. "Where's the sniper replacement?" he asked flatly. Lieutenant Brooke Maddox didn't even blink. "That's her, sir." Hayes stared at me like he was waiting for someone to laugh. "You're kidding." No one did. I didn't say a word. In the Army, silence can carry more weight than any argument. If you try to defend yourself too quickly, people assume you're compensating. So I stood there, calm and steady, letting the room measure me however they wanted. The truth was, I understood exactly what they were seeing. A small replacement arriving in the middle of the worst winter deployment Echo Recon had faced in years. But the real problem wasn't my size, it was the timing. 2 days earlier, Echo Recon had lost their primary marksman, Staff Sergeant Ryan Keller, during a patrol ambush in the Eastern Valley. Keller had been the kind of sniper units rely on for years. Experienced, calm, reliable under pressure. Now he was being flown home with a shattered shoulder, which meant the sniper position covering the southern mountain pass was empty, and that position wasn't just another guard post. It was the most important piece of terrain in the entire valley. The pass controlled the only reliable road cutting through the mountains. Every convoy moving between forward bases used it. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, medical evacuations. If enemy fighters captured that ridge, they wouldn't just threaten one patrol, they would control the entire valley. For weeks, intelligence reports had warned about insurgent groups moving through the mountain channels. Small units, quiet movements, testing the terrain, waiting, and tonight the situation was about to get worse. A massive winter storm was rolling down from the northern ridges. Snow and wind were already swallowing the mountains. Drones couldn't fly. Helicopters were grounded. Satellite imagery was almost useless through the thick cloud cover, which meant the most advanced military in the world had suddenly lost its eyes in the sky. The only early warning left for the entire valley was a sniper sitting on that mountain pass. Major Hayes rubbed his temples slowly, clearly running through the same calculations in his head. Then he looked at me again. "How old are you, specialist?" "19, sir." It wasn't technically a lie. The paperwork said 19. But Hayes leaned back slightly, studying my face with narrowed eyes. "You look about 17. A couple soldiers near the back of the room chuckled quietly. I ignored them. I had heard worse long before I ever wore a uniform. Back home in Bozeman, Montana, my father ran a hunting guide service deep in the Rocky Mountains. Wealthy clients came every winter looking for elk, mule deer, or anything with antlers big enough to mount on a wall. But my father never treated hunting like a sport. To him, it was discipline. By the time I was 12, he had me hiking frozen ridgelines before sunrise, teaching me how to read wind patterns rolling off a mountain face, how to track movement across fresh snow, how to sit completely still for hours without making a sound. He used to tell his clients something that stuck with me for the rest of my life. "Anyone can pull a trigger," he'd say, "but only a patient hunter understands the mountain." That lesson followed me into the Army. But Major Hayes wasn't thinking about Montana hunting guides. He was thinking about the responsibility of sending soldiers into danger. "You're not holding that ridge," he said firmly. I straightened slightly. "Sir, that position is 30 minutes from support in good weather," Hayes continued. The storm outside rattled the walls of the command post as if it wanted to prove his point. Snow was already swallowing the road. "If something happens up there," he said, "you're dead before we can reach you." Lieutenant Maddox spoke quietly beside him. "She graduated top of her sniper class." Hayes didn't even look at her. "I don't care if she graduated from the moon." The room fell silent again. Then Hayes pointed toward the door. "First convoy at sunrise is heading to Bagram." He looked straight at me when he said the next sentence. "Send the kid home." But outside, the storm was already closing the mountain roads. The helicopters couldn't fly, and somewhere in the frozen valleys below us, enemy fighters were already moving through the snow. The first radio call came just before midnight. "Movement East Valley." The words cut through the quiet tension of the command post like a blade. Every conversation stopped instantly. Boots shifted. Heads turned toward the radio console. Then the second call came. Thermal signatures confirmed. Outside, the storm had swallowed the mountains. Wind screamed across the ridges so hard it rattled the walls of the outpost, turning the world beyond the floodlights into a blinding wall of snow and darkness. But storms didn't stop insurgent fighters. If anything, they helped them. Because men who had grown up in these valleys knew every ridge, every rock formation, every hidden trail threading through the mountains. And tonight, those trails were invisible to satellites. Specialist Tanya Ruiz sat hunched over the communications station, her headset pressed tightly against her ears as she monitored the final data stream coming from our reconnaissance drones before the storm forced them down. Her voice was tight when she spoke again, multiple heat signatures moving through the eastern channel. Major Carter Hayes stepped closer to the map table. "How many?" Ruiz hesitated for a second. "Never a good sign. Possibly 20. A quiet curse slipped out of Lieutenant Brooke Maddox beside him. The southern mountain pass was barely 60 meters wide. A narrow cut through the ridgeline where the valley road squeezed between two towering rock walls before opening into the lower basin. If enemy fighters reached that ridge before sunrise, they wouldn't even need to attack the base. They could simply wait. Machine guns positioned along the rocks. Rocket-propelled grenades aimed straight down the road. Every truck in the morning convoy would drive directly into a kill zone. Fuel carriers, ammunition trucks, medical vehicles. Dozens of soldiers packed into armored transports with nowhere to turn. A massacre before the first shot was even fired. Major Hayes studied the map in silence, calculating. Echo Recon was already stretched thin. Every soldier in the unit had been assigned to defensive positions around the outpost. Machine gun teams covered the perimeter. Patrol units guarded the northern wire. The mortar team was on standby in case of a direct assault. There was no spare manpower, no quick reaction force, and only one operational sniper rifle left in the entire outpost. The room slowly went quiet as that realization settled in, because there was also only one trained sniper inside the building. Me. Hayes lifted his eyes from the map and looked directly at me again. His jaw tightened slightly. "You're still here?" "Yes, sir." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue with the universe itself. Then the radio crackled again. Ruiz's voice came through sharper this time. "Enemy scouts confirmed in the lower ridge channel." That channel was less than a kilometer from the southern pass, which meant they weren't approaching. They were already climbing. Major Hayes closed his eyes for a brief second, then exhaled slowly. When he looked up again, the decision had already been made. "Cole." "Yes, sir." "Can you hold the observation ridge?" Outside, the storm slammed into the mountain like a freight train, wind howling so hard it sounded like the entire valley was tearing itself apart. In my mind, I could see the terrain clearly. The valley road winding through the rocks, the narrow pass where the cliffs tightened around it, and the convoy scheduled to drive through that road at sunrise. Dozens of soldiers who had no idea what was moving through the mountains above them right now. I didn't need time to think about the answer. "Yes, sir." Major Hayes studied my face carefully for several long seconds. He wasn't searching for confidence. He was searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that suggested he was making the wrong call, but there was nothing there. Finally, he nodded once. "Take the rifle." The room fell completely silent. Lieutenant Maddox stepped forward and lifted the long-range sniper rifle from the rack against the wall. She handed it to me carefully, her eyes meeting mine for just a moment. Not doubt, not pity, respect. The metal of the rifle was already ice cold in my hands. Major Hayes spoke one last time as I turned toward the door. "If things go bad," he stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We both understood what he meant. If things went bad up there, no one would reach me in time. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and stepped outside. The storm swallowed me instantly. Within seconds, the lights from Echo Recon disappeared behind the wall of blowing snow. The wind shoved against my chest as I began climbing the narrow trail toward the observation ridge. Every step sank into frozen drifts. Every breath burned in my lungs. The climb took 30 brutal minutes. By the time I reached the top, the storm had erased every footprint behind me. The mountain looked untouched, silent, empty. But I knew better. I dropped into a prone position behind a jagged rock formation and lifted the rifle to my shoulder. The valley below was a shifting blur of snow and shadow. Then something moved. A dark figure crossing the lower ridge. Then another. Then more shapes appearing through the storm. 5, 10, 15. My stomach tightened as I counted them, because suddenly the math no longer matched the radio reports. This wasn't 20 fighters. Through the blowing snow, I could now see nearly 30 silhouettes climbing steadily toward the pass, and they were already halfway up the mountain. The cold up there wasn't just uncomfortable, it was violent. Minus 22 degrees, maybe colder with the wind. It cut straight through the layers of my uniform and settled into my bones like a slow poison. Every gust that tore across the ridge felt like shards of glass slicing across my face. Even breathing hurt. The moisture from each breath froze instantly against the scarf covering my mouth, turning the fabric stiff with ice. My gloves were already stiffening too, the fabric growing rigid as frost crept across the seams. Most soldiers in that kind of weather would have started firing the moment they spotted the enemy. Instinct, fear, adrenaline. But panic burns through ammunition faster than anything else on a battlefield. And ammunition was the one thing I couldn't afford to waste. So I stayed still, flat against the frozen rock, watching. The wind was blowing hard from the west, dragging sheets of snow across the mountainside. Every time the gusts hit the ridgeline, the snow curled around the rock formations and spilled downward into the narrow channels cutting through the slope. Those channels were the only places a climbing force could find cover from the storm. which meant the enemy would follow them, which meant I knew exactly where they would appear. I steadied the rifle against the rock and lowered my cheek against the cold stock. The metal was so cold it burned against my skin. Through the scope, the world narrowed into a tight circle of swirling snow and dark stone. Then a figure stepped into the opening between two rock shelves. 60 meters. He was moving carefully, crouched low, rifle slung across his chest. I watched the wind blowing across the ridge, left to right, strong. I adjusted the scope half a click. Slow breath in, slow breath out. Then I squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked through the blizzard, the sound sharp and violent against the howl of the wind. Through the scope, I saw the fighter collapse instantly, his body dropping backward into the snow. For 3 long seconds, nothing moved. Then chaos erupted below. Shouting, men diving for cover. One of the fighters sprinted toward the fallen body, trying to drag it back behind the rocks. I shifted the rifle slightly. Second shot. The round struck him before he even reached the body. He folded forward into the snow beside the first. 2 down. The rest of the fighters scattered immediately, scrambling behind rocks and frozen ridges. Good. Confusion is a sniper's best weapon. I rolled away from the firing position instantly, crawling 20 feet along the ridge to another rock outcropping. If they tried to trace the direction of the shot, they'd be looking at an empty position. The storm helped. The wind swallowed the rifle's echo, scattering the sound across the mountain. Snow whipped across the slope so violently that even muzzle flash was almost impossible to see. From their perspective, the shots could have come from anywhere. Minutes passed. The fighters regrouped slowly, climbing again through the channels carved into the mountainside. Another silhouette appeared between two rocks. I steadied the rifle. Third shot. The man dropped instantly. A fourth fighter leaned out from behind a boulder to locate the shooter. Fourth shot. He vanished behind the rock, sliding down into the snow. Another tried to sprint across an exposed section of the slope. Fifth shot. His body tumbled down the incline. Below me, the enemy fighters were shouting into their radios now, voices sharp with confusion and anger. I could see them pointing toward different sections of the ridge, arguing about where the fire was coming from. They believed they were under attack from multiple snipers positioned across the mountain, but there was only one. Just me, the storm, and a mountain that rewarded patience. I shifted positions again, crawling through the snow to another firing point. My elbows and knees were numb now, the cold biting through the fabric of my uniform. But the climb below me had slowed. The fighters were hesitant now. Every time one of them tried to advance, another body fell into the snow. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. By the time the enemy attempted their second coordinated push up the mountain, 11 fighters were already scattered across the slope. The rest were angry now, determined, which made them dangerous. I steadied the rifle again, preparing for the next shot. And that's when the real problem started. When I pulled the bolt back to chamber another round, it didn't move. The metal was frozen solid. The first time the rifle bolt stuck, a cold realization hit me harder than the wind. This might be where the fight ends. In temperatures like this, metal doesn't forgive mistakes. Steel contracts. Moisture freezes. Every tiny moving part inside a weapon can turn into a locked piece of ice. Which meant every shot from this point forward came with a terrifying question. Would the rifle fire again, or would it fail when I needed it most? I pulled the bolt slowly, forcing it back with steady pressure instead of panic. For a second it refused to move. Then a sharp cracking sound echoed from the chamber as ice fractured along the metal. The bolt slid open, barely. I chambered another round and steadied the rifle again, forcing my breathing back under control. Below me, the enemy fighters had stopped charging straight up the mountain. They were adapting. Instead of pushing through the narrow channels, they were spreading along the rock formations, trying to move wider across the ridgeline. Flanking, smart, very smart, they had finally realized something wasn't right. 11 fighters were already down, but they still hadn't seen the shooter. From their perspective, the only explanation was multiple snipers covering the mountain. I decided to let them keep believing that. I slung the rifle across my shoulder and crawled along the ridgeline, pushing through deep snow toward a completely different rock formation nearly 30 meters away. The wind helped cover the movement, whipping loose snow across the ground and erasing my tracks almost instantly. When I reached the new position, I settled behind the rock and lifted the rifle again. A fighter moved cautiously between two boulders below. Different angle, different firing lane. I squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the storm. The fighter dropped immediately. Shouting exploded again across the mountainside. The enemy scattered in confusion, some diving behind rocks, others pointing toward entirely different parts of the ridge, exactly what I wanted. But then something caught my eye through the swirling snow. Movement far to the north. At first I thought it was drifting snow. Then I saw the shape clearly. Another group of fighters. 6, maybe 8 of them. And they weren't climbing toward me. They were moving straight toward Recon's defensive wire. My stomach tightened. The fighters on the mountain had been the distraction. If that second group reached the base while the others kept me pinned on the ridge, the outpost would suddenly be fighting enemies from 2 directions. And Recon was already stretched thin. Machine gun teams covered the perimeter, but visibility in the storm was terrible. Those fighters could reach the wire before anyone even realized they were there. I had seconds to decide. Stay hidden on the ridge and keep thinning the force climbing toward me, or risk revealing my position to save the outpost. Either choice carried consequences, but the decision didn't take long. I reached into the pouch on my vest and pulled out a signal flare. Through the scope, I watched the northern group creeping closer to the defensive wire, their dark figures barely visible against the storm. 10 meters. 8. 5. I waited until the moment they were closest to the perimeter. Then I fired the flare behind them. The signal round shot into the sky with a violent hiss, cutting through the storm before bursting overhead in a brilliant explosion of white light. For a few seconds, the entire battlefield looked like daylight. And every enemy fighter near the base was suddenly outlined against the snow like a target painted on the mountain. Inside Recon, the soldiers reacted instantly. Machine guns roared to life. Tracer rounds ripped through the night. The northern attackers never even had time to run. Gunfire erupted across the valley the moment the flare burst overhead. The quiet mountain exploded into noise. Machine guns from Recon opened up instantly, their barrels flashing through the storm as long bursts of tracer fire tore across the snow. The soldiers inside the outpost didn't hesitate for even a second. The moment those enemy fighters were silhouetted by the flare, the defenders reacted exactly the way they had trained to. Rounds ripped through the northern slope. The insurgents near the wire scattered in panic, diving for rocks and frozen ground, but most of them were caught in the open. 2 of them dropped immediately. Another spun sideways and disappeared into the snow as the machine gun fire walked across the ridge. For a few seconds, the battlefield was chaos. Then the flare began to fade, and the mountain went dark again. But that brief moment of light had done more than save the outpost. It had also betrayed me, because every fighter climbing the southern ridge now knew exactly where the shot had come from. My position. Within seconds, the men below me changed direction. They weren't searching anymore, they were hunting. The first bullet slammed into the rock beside my shoulder with a violent crack. Chips of stone exploded into the snow around me. Then another round struck the ridge just inches above my head. The enemy fighters had spotted the flare trail. Now every rifle on the mountain was firing toward the ridge. Snow erupted into white clouds around me as rounds smashed into the rocks, punching through the frozen ground and ricocheting across the slope. The storm muffled some of the sound, but the impact of the rounds was impossible to miss. I rolled sideways and slid behind a narrow rock crevice, dragging the rifle with me as another bullet struck the edge of my previous position. For a moment, I stayed there, breathing slowly, forcing my hands to stay steady. My gloves were stiff with frost now, and the cold had split the skin across my knuckles. Thin streaks of blood had frozen along the fabric, turning the material dark and rigid. But pain wasn't the problem. Pain was something you could ignore. Ammunition was not. I checked the magazine and counted the rounds left in the pouch attached to my vest. 7. 7 rounds to stop the fighters still climbing toward the ridge. I carefully lifted the rifle back toward the opening between the rocks and scanned the slope below. At least 8 insurgents were still moving up the mountain. 8 men, 7 bullets. Not good odds. I slowed my breathing the way my father had taught me years ago on frozen ridgelines back in Montana. Panic shortens your breath. Short breaths shake your hands, and shaking hands miss targets. I picked the closest fighter climbing through the snow. He was crouched low, trying to stay hidden behind a line of rocks as he moved. I let the crosshair settle, then squeezed. The rifle cracked again, echoing across the mountain. The fighter collapsed instantly. 6 rounds left. Another insurgent appeared seconds later, climbing over a jagged rock ledge. He barely had time to raise his weapon. I fired again. The shot knocked him backward off the rock, his body sliding down the slope into the snow. 5 rounds. The remaining fighters were closing the distance now. Less than 40 meters, 30, too close for a sniper rifle to be comfortable. Sniper rifles are built for precision at distance, not desperate fights on frozen ridgelines. The next fighter sprinted between two rock formations, trying to rush the ridge before I could line up another shot. I tracked him through the scope, adjusting for the wind that howled across the slope. Just as I was about to fire, something strange happened. The wind shifted. Until that moment, the storm had been blowing across the ridge from west to east, but suddenly the current changed. The wind turned and began roaring up the valley instead. Snow blasted upward across the mountain face, slamming directly into the fighters climbing toward me. They had to turn their heads just to see through the blowing snow. The gusts shoved against their bodies as they struggled to climb. But where I was positioned on the ridge, the rocks blocked most of the wind. My view stayed clear. I watched the fighters below stumble through the sudden wall of snow, blinking and shielding their faces as the storm hit them full force. For the first time all night, the mountain tilted the balance. The enemy was climbing blind, and I wasn't. I steadied the rifle again, because sometimes survival in the mountains isn't about strength. Sometimes it's about patience. And sometimes the mountain chooses a side. The final group of fighters was less than 20 meters away. At that distance, the mountain no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a knife fight waiting to happen. The storm roared around the ridge, but through the wind I could hear them clearly now. The crunch of boots biting into frozen snow, the scrape of gear against rock, the low shouts between men trying to coordinate their final push. They knew they were close, too close for them to turn back now. I pressed tighter against the frozen rock and checked the rifle. 4 rounds, 4 chances to stop them before the fight turned into something much worse. My fingers were stiff from the cold, the skin across my knuckles cracked and burning beneath my gloves. Every movement felt slower than it should have been, but the scope was steady. The wind was still pushing snow straight into the enemy's faces as they climbed, blinding them just enough to give me a few extra seconds. I waited. Patience had saved me all night. It would save me again. Then the first helmet appeared above the edge of the rock shelf. The fighter pulled himself up onto the ridge, rifle already coming up to fire. I squeezed the trigger. The shot slammed into his chest before he could even see me. His body dropped instantly, sliding backward down the icy slope. 3 rounds left. The second fighter tried to rush forward the moment the first man fell. He scrambled over the rocks, moving fast, trying to close the distance before I could reset the rifle. I tracked him through the scope, shot. He collapsed beside the first. 2 rounds left. For a moment, everything went still. The last two fighters had stopped just below the ridgeline, hidden somewhere behind the rocks. I could no longer see them through the scope, but I could hear them, their breathing, their boots shifting against the ice. They were thinking now, trying to figure out how many shooters were waiting for them above. I kept the rifle trained on the ridgeline, waiting for the next helmet to appear. Seconds passed, then something unexpected happened. The fighters didn't move. Instead, they froze, listening. At first I didn't understand why. Then I heard it too. Faint through the storm. Footsteps. Not below the ridge, behind them. Someone was climbing up the mountain. The sound grew clearer with every second, boots digging into frozen ground, gear shifting, heavy breathing cutting through the wind. My heart lifted. Echo Recon. I glanced briefly over my shoulder. Two dark figures were pushing through the storm up the ridgeline trail. Major Carter Hayes, Lieutenant Brooke Maddox, and just behind them, two soldiers from the outpost struggling through the snow with rifles ready. They had climbed the mountain in the middle of a blizzard to reinforce me, but they were still 50 meters away, too far to reach the ridge before the final fighters did. The two insurgents hiding below the ridge realized the same thing almost instantly. They could hear the approaching soldiers too, which meant they understood something very important. If they didn't break through the ridge now, they would be trapped between two forces. So they made the only move left to them. They charged. Both fighters burst over the rock shelf at the same time, rifles raised, snow exploding around their boots as they rushed forward through the storm, and I had exactly 2 rounds left. The first fighter burst over the ridge with his rifle already raised. At that distance, there was no time for careful calculations, no time to think about wind drift or range adjustments. Everything slowed into a narrow tunnel of instinct and discipline. I pulled the trigger, the rifle thundered against my shoulder, the recoil sharp through my frozen arms. Through the scope, I saw the round strike center mass. The fighter staggered backward, his weapon slipping from his hands before he collapsed onto the ice-covered rock. 1 round left. The last insurgent stopped just a few steps behind where the first man had fallen. For a brief second, he simply stared at me through the swirling snow, both of us frozen in that strange moment when two people realize the fight has come down to a single heartbeat. The wind howled across the ridge, whipping loose snow between us like smoke drifting across a battlefield. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, from exhaustion and cold that had been gnawing at my muscles for over an hour. The rifle suddenly felt heavier than it had all night. My gloves were stiff with frozen blood where the skin across my knuckles had split open. My breath came in slow clouds of vapor that disappeared instantly into the storm. But the crosshairs were still steady. The insurgent raised his weapon, and in that instant, everything else faded away. The storm, the mountain, the burning cold, all of it disappeared until there was only the sight picture inside my scope. I squeezed the trigger. The final shot echoed across the valley like a crack of thunder. For a moment, the fighter remained standing as if the mountain itself had frozen time. Then his body folded quietly into the snow. And suddenly, everything went silent. The gunfire from the valley had stopped. The storm still roared across the ridgeline, but the battle itself was over. No more figures moved below the ridge. No more shadows climbed through the snow. Just bodies scattered across the slope where the enemy assault had collapsed. I slowly lowered the rifle, my arms finally beginning to feel the full weight of the night. A few seconds later, I heard boots crunching behind me. Major Carter Hayes climbed over the last rock ledge and stepped onto the ridge, breathing hard from the brutal climb through the storm. Lieutenant Brooke Maddox followed right behind him, her rifle still raised as she scanned the slope below. Both of them stopped when they saw the mountain. Bodies lay scattered across the channels and rock shelves the fighters had used for cover. Dark shapes half buried by drifting snow stretched across the slope in every direction. Neither officer said anything for a long moment. Major Hayes slowly walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down the mountainside, studying the battlefield below. When he finally turned back toward me, his expression had completely changed from the one I had seen earlier that night. No doubt, no disbelief, just quiet understanding. "How long were you up here?" he asked. My voice sounded rough from the cold when I answered. "About an hour and a half, sir." Hayes nodded slowly, looking back toward the slope one more time as the wind pushed snow across the fallen fighters. Later, when the reports were written and the battlefield was documented, the numbers would tell the full story. 93 minutes of combat on that frozen ridge. 25 enemy fighters eliminated before they could reach the mountain pass. One sniper holding the entire valley approach alone while a storm tried to bury the battlefield under snow. But in that moment, standing on the ridge with the wind roaring across the mountain, the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was simple. The pass was still ours, and every soldier driving through that valley at sunrise would make it home alive. The storm finally began to loosen its grip just after sunrise. The wind didn't stop all at once. It slowly softened, like the mountain itself was finally catching its breath after a long night of violence. The heavy clouds began to break apart, and pale morning light spilled across the ridgeline for the first time in hours. As the sky brightened, the valley below slowly came into view, and that's when Major Carter Hayes, saw the battlefield clearly for the first time. What had been shadows and flashes of movement during the storm was now impossible to ignore. The mountainside below Echo Recon was scattered with bodies. Some lay near the narrow rock channels the fighters had used to climb the ridge. Others were frozen where they had fallen in the open snowfields, half buried already as the wind pushed drifts across the slope. 25 enemy fighters, all of them stopped before they could reach the pass. Major Hayes stood at the edge of the ridge beside me, his gloved hands resting on his hips as he studied the valley in silence. Lieutenant Brooke Maddox stood a few steps away, scanning the horizon out of habit even though the fight was clearly over. Far below us, the convoy road wound through the valley like a thin gray ribbon. In another hour, the first supply trucks would begin moving through that pass. Fuel carriers, medical vehicles, soldiers packed inside armored transports, probably complaining about the cold and wondering how bad the road conditions would be. None of them would ever know how close they had come to driving into an ambush. If even half of the fighters scattered across the slope had reached the ridge, the story would have ended very differently. Major Hayes finally turned toward me. The look in his eyes wasn't the same one he had given me in the command post hours earlier. That earlier look had been doubt. This one was something else entirely. "How old are you, Cole?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the cold air between us. For a moment I didn't answer. I could still hear the words he had said the night before. Send the kid home. But the truth didn't feel like something worth hiding anymore. So I answered him honestly. 17, sir." The mountain wind carried the words away across the ridge. Major Hayes didn't react immediately. He just stared at me for several long seconds, the reality of that answer settling in slowly. Then he looked back down at the mountainside one more time. 25 fighters scattered across the snow. A ridge that had nearly become a kill zone. A convoy road that would now stay open. Finally, he shook his head once. Not in anger, not in disbelief, more like someone realizing how wrong their first judgment had been. "You're not the kid I thought you were," he said. The official investigation came later. Paperwork always follows the battlefield. When the Army discovered the age error in my enlistment file, regulations left them with no choice. I was separated from service while the situation was reviewed. For a while, it felt like the mountain had erased everything that night had meant. But stories move fast in the military, especially the ones soldiers tell each other. Echo Recon didn't forget. Neither did the convoy crews who learned later what had almost happened on that ridge. 11 months after that night, I turned 18. The moment I was legally eligible again, I re-enlisted. This time, the paperwork was correct. And when I reported back to my new unit, no one questioned whether I belonged there, because by then the story had already spread. The storm. The mountain pass. The sniper who had held the ridge alone while 30 fighters climbed through a blizzard. And the soldiers who had once been told to send the kid home remembered something very different. On the coldest night of that winter, when the storm blinded the valley, and the enemy thought the mountain belonged to them, a young woman stood alone on that ridge and refused to let it fall. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Lady Veteran Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?